Fog rolled off the jagged bluffs of coastal Maine like a restless tide of ghosts. It was October 17th, 1903, a date that would be whispered for generations in the small harbor town of Taros Bay. A pair of fishermen, brothers Thomas and Eli Rourke, were dragging for cod before dawn when their net snagged something heavy. At first they thought it a trunk, half-rotted, covered in seaweed and barnacle. When they hauled it onto the deck, it split open under its own weight, and from within tumbled a tarnished silver locket, a child's shoe, and the brittle bones of a human hand, still wearing a ring carved with the image of a raven. They rowed back to shore, in silence. By the time the sheriff arrived, word had spread through the town like a sickness. That ring, its dark gemstone center engraved with Latin letters, in tenebris, was unmistakable. Every local knew it belonged to Dr. Silas Ravencroft, patriarch of the wealthiest, most secretive family in York County. The Ravencrofts had vanished nearly 30 years before, without farewell or graves, leaving behind an estate locked behind iron gates and rumors of something unholy beneath its foundations. Now, a piece of them had come back from the sea. Even before the coroner spoke a word, mothers clutched their children, old men crossed themselves, and the minister muttered that some doors, once sealed, were meant to stay that way. But the tide, as it turned out, had other ideas. What the ocean returned that morning would reopen the oldest wound Taros Bay ever bore, and drag into daylight a century of secrets rooted in blood, ambition, and perhaps something far darker than either. Before we continue with the story of Dr. Silas Ravencroft and his ill-fated bloodline, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The lighthouse on the northern point was still kept by hand in those years, its lamp fueled by whale oil and tended each twilight. Taros Bay, in 1903, was a frontier between the modern and the ancient. The rail line stopped 3 towns south, and electricity had not yet reached its weather-beaten rooftops. Most of its families were descendants of shipwrights and sailors who had once built the trading vessels of New England's Golden Age. But by the turn of the century, their industry had withered. The docks stood half-empty, warehouses shuttered, salt air eating at shutter hinges and hearts alike. Beyond the harbor stretched hills scattered with spruce and birch. There, in the distance, like a vulture perched on the landscape, stood Ravencroft Hall. Stone walls blackened by years of smoke and rain. Windows narrow, as if peering inward instead of out. The estate predated the Revolution by nearly half a century, founded by Captain Archibald Ravencroft, an English privateer who had turned smuggler after the Crown's wars ended. In its heyday, the family's wealth rivaled the steamboat barons of Boston. They owned much of the timber and shipping rights across southern Maine. But prosperity, locals said, came to them in a way that no man ought to envy. Late 18th century documents describe a fire that consumed half the original house. Town record books list the burial of 6 servants that winter, their cause of death unstated. A surviving ledger in the Historical Society's archive mentions large shipments of quicklime and unstamped liquor barrels, items that raised more questions than they answered. Even then, the Ravencrofts were objects of uneasy fascination. They built their chapel not in town but within their own grounds, consecrated by a priest no one could ever name. When townsfolk petitioned to open the family's private wharf to commercial shipping, the proposal mysteriously vanished from record. Some said money changed hands in Augusta. Others preferred to believe the family had friends not in politics but elsewhere. The smell of tar and brine filled the air in those days, a perpetual perfume of survival. Husbands labored at sea, wives mended nets. The church bell tolled with a rhythm that marked the heart of the community. Life was harsh but predictable, until the Ravencroft tragedies began. In 1874, a maid named Honora Clegg was found wandering barefoot on the main road, her eyes vacant, her lips muttering about voices beneath the walls. She died 2 weeks later in a poorhouse bed. That same summer, Dr. Silas Ravencroft sealed the house and dismissed his remaining staff. Then, silence. For decades, no living Ravencroft was seen again. Only the crows kept company on those parapets. By 1903, that long silence had hardened into folklore. Children dared one another to sneak past the gates on All Hallows' Eve. The minister warned against dabbling with God's forgotten things. Yet, for the older residents, the ones who remembered smoke curling from those chimneys or had heard the cry of a carriage on the gravel drive, it wasn't superstition, but memory. They had heard once the sound of a piano from within that mansion on a winter night. And so when the sea delivered its grotesque gift, the ring, the locket, the small bone hand, the town could no longer pretend that the Ravencrofts were only legends. The sheriff, a square-jawed man named Everett Flynn, sent telegrams to the state police and summoned a coroner from Portland. But already the crowds had gathered at the shore, craning for a glimpse. Among them stood Thomas and Eli Rourke, pale and shaken. "It weren't the sea bringing that up," Eli whispered to his brother. "That hand, Tom, it was clean. No sea rot, no crab marks. Like it had been kept, not lost." The setting sun that evening turned the horizon bruised purple. Father O'Leary, the pastor of St. Bridget's Parish, was seen sprinkling holy water over the tide pools. The people dispersed slowly, as if afraid to turn their backs. In the tavern that night, men spoke of devils and debts, of the Ravencrofts' supposed dealings with a secret fraternity. One sailor swore his grandfather told of ritual feasts held on storm nights, the old hall windows flickering with candlelight long after the church bell had struck 12. Whatever the truth, the town would soon learn that legends have a way of breathing again when given a name, a date, and a single human bone. And the name on every tongue that autumn was Ravencroft. Long before the ring and bone washed ashore in 1903, the Ravencroft name already carried with it the weight of whispers. To understand the dread that filled Taro's Bay that October, we must return to its beginning, to the era when America was half wild, half dream, and men like Archibald Ravencroft shaped their destinies by musket and compass. Archibald arrived from Bristol in 1749, a tall man with storm-gray eyes and the gait of one accustomed to command. The colonies then were a tapestry of ambition stitched with gunpowder. The French and Indian War loomed, and every harbor along the New England coast bristled with makeshift fortifications. Archibald came as a privateer's captain in service to the British Crown, or so he claimed. He purchased land by the water, cleared it with hired hands, and raised a mansion on the highest hill, built from granite quarried by prisoners. The locals called it Ravencroft Hall even before the roof beam was set. They said the house was designed by a foreign architect who had never seen Maine's winters, with hallways far too long and a cellar that tunneled into the cliff itself. One mason, Peter Lawton, swore he was asked to carve peculiar symbols into the cornerstone, circles intersected by triangles and stars, under Archibald's stern eye. Protection marks, the captain called them, against misfortune on the sea. Yet when the cornerstone was consecrated, no minister was invited. Instead, Archibald unrolled a leather-bound script in some alien language and intoned passages to the wind. The centuries shifted. Wars came and went. Colonists became revolutionaries. Through it all, the Ravencrofts prospered. Their ships bore munitions under false manifests, sold cod and timber down the Carolinas, and smuggled brandy by moonlight. Archibald's son Nathaniel took the helm after the elder's death, or disappearance, depending on which accounts you trust. The family never held a public funeral, though local records list the captain's estate as being left in perpetuity to his heirs. Townsfolk muttered that Archibald's body was never found, that one dawn the mansion's windows were thrown open, curtains billowing, as if something unseen had departed. By the early 1800s, the fledgling United States had found its footing, and Taro's Bay grew modestly with it, Shipyards hammering, sawmills grinding, Methodist sermons punctuating Sunday mornings. The Ravencrofts, meanwhile, evolved from sailors into gentlemen. They sponsored the building of a small schoolhouse, funded the town's first medicinal dispensary, and entertained visiting clergy and merchants. To the casual observer, they were patrons of progress. Yet beneath that benevolent gloss lingered their curious isolation. They intermarried with no local families, traveled frequently to Europe, and held private services in the mansion's chapel rather than attending town church. An entry in the 1831 diary of Lydia Ames, daughter of a local tailor, records at a dinner she attended there as companion to a guest's wife. Her writing, preserved in the Historical Society's archives, trembles between awe and unease. The lady of the house, Mrs. Constance Ravencroft, received us most graciously, yet I confess I felt an oppression within those walls I cannot name. Candles burned with a greenish hue, and the air was perfumed with some foreign spice. A pianoforte played from the next room, though no one sat before it. She noted, too, an infant's cry echoing through the halls where no child was seen. By mid-century, the family fortune reached its peak. Dr. Silas Ravencroft, grandson of Archibald and heir to the estate, returned from medical studies in Edinburgh and Paris, proclaiming a passion for the boundaries of life and death. He established a private clinic on the property and invited a cadre of select students from Boston and Providence to assist in his anatomical research. The townspeople, proud that science had come to their doorstep, at first welcomed him, but when grave robbing turned epidemic in nearby churchyards, welcome turned to suspicion. It was during this era that Taros Bay took on its dual nature, half caught in Enlightenment fervor, half chained to Puritan dread. Telegraph wires hummed along the main road. The newspaper from Portland arrived weekly, its ink smudged by sea damp. Men debated Darwin and industrial progress while still nailing horseshoes over door frames to fend off witches. Against that backdrop, the Ravencrofts' experiments became the fault line between modernity and fear. In 1868, a traveling journalist from the Boston Evening Traveler, Henry Pike, paid call on Dr. Ravencroft, seeking insight into new surgical techniques. His notes survive in fragmentary form in the paper's archives. The doctor, Pike wrote, speaks eloquently of electricity as the spark that might reawaken the inert. He demonstrated an apparatus of his own design, comprised of copper coils and a saline bath sufficient to immerse an adult limb. When I queried the source of his subjects, his smile grew still and distant. After that visit, Pike disappeared en route home. The last record of him is his signature in the guest ledger at the Harbor Inn. While the wider world marched into the Gilded Age, railways roaring, factories belching, fortunes built on iron and oil, the coast of Maine remained huddled against its storms, slow to change. Taros Bay still smelled of fish oil and wood smoke. Children played stickball in muddy lanes. Sea shanties drifted from tavern doors. Yet even those cozy noises seemed to die when one faced the road leading to the Ravencroft gates. Iron vines twined the entrance. Beyond them, rumors said, the good doctor's wife had grown sickly, his offspring unschooled, his servants mute and foreign. Old Mrs. Pierce, who ran the post stable, told anyone who'd listen how she once delivered a parcel there and overheard low chanting from behind the carriage house, men's voices rising and falling as if in prayer, though the words were not English. The past and present tangled so tightly here that history wasn't a timeline. It was a fog that clung to the cliffs. Each generation inherited half-truths. Children were warned not to wander near the hall after dusk, not because of ghosts, but because the Ravencrofts never buried their wrongs where God could see. By 1874, the year of the Maid's breakdown, the U.S. was celebrating its centennial. Presidents were arguing over Reconstruction, and telephones were a rumor from distant cities. Yet, in Taros Bay, candles still lit the night, and fear still wore its old, familiar smile. That is the world into which Silas Ravencroft vanished, and from which his ring would one day return to breach the peace of an unsuspecting town. The first light of dawn slid over the Atlantic like pale mercury, revealing the black silhouette of Ravencroft Hall against an amber horizon. Its chimneys were broken, roofs softened by moss, but the outline remained proud, defiant. That morning, Sheriff Everett Flynn rode up the narrow, rutted path to the estate with 2 deputies, a coroner in tow, and the lingering stink of low-tide rot from the bone found at sea. He said little during the climb, only clenched his jaw when gulls circled overhead, shrieking like tormentors. By noon, word of his expedition had filled the taverns. Outsiders began arriving, amateur historians, fishermen claiming relation to the Ravencroft servants of old, and 1 or 2 reporters chasing morbid fame. Among those first to step through the iron gates that October day were 3 figures whose names would be written at the footnote of every retelling. Sheriff Flynn, Reverend Patrick O'Leary of St. Brigid's Parish, and Miss Clara Winscombe, a young journalist from Boston hired by the Evening Chronicle to document the reopened haunted house by the sea. Clara was 28 and unbending in the way only a woman who had clawed her way into a man's profession could be then. She arrived clad in a gray coat and wide-brimmed hat, her boots already clotted with mud. She carried a satchel of papers, a fountain pen she polished as if ritual, and eyes that missed nothing. Her editor had told her, "You want people to read your column, give them truth dressed in death." She had expected some Gothic ruin. What she found instead was something stranger, decay without death, beauty bound in its own shroud. "Lord's mercy," whispered Deputy Ames as they approached the main doorway, its great iron knocker shaped like a raven's head. "You reckon there's anyone left living up here?" Flynn spat to one side. "Ain't been a footprint past this gate since Grover Cleveland's first term. But someone, or something, kept the shutters in place. Wind don't hammer nails." Reverend O'Leary shook his head. "I told you, Sheriff, this soil is not at rest." "If the dead are restless, Father, that's your department," Flynn replied. Clara knelt at the threshold where the sea breeze funneled through the cracks, raising goose flesh even under her gloves. She traced the engraved raven sigil worked into the brass plate and murmured, "They built this to intimidate, not to welcome." The house answered with silence. Inside, their lamps drew shapes from the dark, dust like frozen breath, portraits staring from gilt frames, a grand staircase rising toward a gallery that sagged like the ribs of some long-dead whale. Every surface was coated in soot, but on one marble table near the entrance lay a curious thing, fresh salt residue, glistening as though the ocean itself had paid visit during the night. The coroner, Dr. Wilhelmina Greer, a stoic woman of 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles, examined the crust under her magnifier. Salt water, no doubt, but how could it be wet? It hasn't rained in 3 days. "Sea mist comes far inland," O'Leary muttered. Flynn said nothing. He was studying the portrait above the mantel, Dr. Silas Ravencroft himself, painted sometime before 1870. The man's face was drawn with scholar's finery, dark hair, severe brow, the faintest smirk of intellect, but the eyes held an uncanny spark, unsettlingly alive. Hours later, Clara described that portrait in her notes. "I have interviewed murderers, seen drownings lifted from the wharf, but nothing has ever stared through me quite like Dr. Silas Ravencroft's painted gaze. It is not vanity upon that canvas, it is anticipation." That day at the mansion marked the modern beginning of the case. Each stranger pulled into the old orbit of the family would leave changed. The hall was no longer just a ruin. It was evidence. Clara spent her nights lodging at the Harbor Inn. Her landlady, Mrs. Pierce, the same who once delivered parcels to the family, was eager to gossip. On Clara's second evening, the lamplight flickered as the storm hissed beyond the windows. "They say he didn't die at all," Mrs. Pierce whispered, pouring tea into chipped china. "The doctor, I mean. They say he got too friendly with his own subjects, that he learned how to make things move that ought to stay still. Clara set her cup down, pen poised. And what do you believe, Mrs. Pierce? The old woman's blue eyes misted behind spectacles. Believe? Miss Winscombe. Belief don't enter it. I heard him once years ago, the last night the chimney smoked. He was singing in Latin, voice twisted up with the wind. Then came a sound, like chains dragged cross-stone, and quiet. Been quiet ever since. Word spread that Clara meant to write a full exposé. Men at the tavern muttered she would provoke damnation upon the town. The sheriff warned her to keep the investigation secular. The reverend, for his part, prayed on her behalf every morning. Yet when someone sealed in literature and reason steps into a place built of superstition, sometimes the ledger of truth starts to blur. On her fourth day, Clara convinced Flynn to let her review the police dossier surrounding the ring and locket. The locket's clasp had fused with salt corrosion, but when pried open it revealed a miniature portrait of a child, paint fading, brushwork hurried. Behind the painting, another engraving, almost missed by the coroner. In memoriam, E.R. We've scoured census records, Flynn told her, tapping the paper. No Ravencroft child listed with those initials. Families like these have a habit of erasing what shames them, Clara replied. The sheriff nodded. Erasing or burying, either way. Meanwhile, the town began reporting small disturbances. A boy claimed he saw candlelight flickering in the mansion's windows past midnight. Fishermen swore the water below the cliffs had gone unnatural still, even in wind. And one evening, the church cat, a beloved creature named St. Jude, was found dead upon the threshold of St. Brigid's, its body unmarked, but its paws stained with what looked like soot. 3 figures now stood at opposite ends of belief. The grizzled sheriff bound by duty, the weary priest fretting about old sins, and the audacious journalist hungry for proof. Each watched the other's resolve falter under the weight of mounting unease. Reverend O'Leary confronted Flynn beside the docks the following Sunday. You must close that place again, he urged. The forerunners of the Ravencrofts trafficked with devils. The doctor was no mere physician. He sought dominion over the soul. Flynn struck a match, lighting his pipe. Father, you see devils because your job's to fight them. I see liars and opportunists. Likely someone's making coin off ghost tales, hoping we'll back off. Then explain the salt in his hall, O'Leary hissed. The hand from the sea. The sheriff exhaled a plume of smoke. I can explain the hand. I just ain't sure you'll like it. The priest's stare stayed steady. Try me. Bodies wash up, Father. That's what the ocean does. What it don't do is wear jewelry carved for a family that disappeared 30 years back. Somebody's staging this, dragging bones out of graves to stir up fear or sell newspapers. That night, when Flynn climbed into bed, he dreamed of a storm, the kind that strips skin from masts, and of a man standing on the hall's parapet, lightning etched across his face. Only when lightning struck twice did the sheriff realize, in the dream, that the man's eyes reflected fire, though the storm had no flame. He woke before dawn, soaked in sweat, the echo of waves still hammering his skull. And somewhere beyond the town, the hall waited in silence, as it had always done, patient, watchful, alive. The salt wind turned colder as November settled on Taro's Bay, and with it came disquiet. No one could say when the unease began, only that it crept, the way damp spreads behind wallpaper. Lamps guttered for no reason. Clocks lost time. The ocean, once the heartbeat of the town, grew sullen and low, its tides retreating half a day too long. It started small, as all horrors do. A fisherman reported finding eels twisted dead in their traps, their skin etched with tiny burns like lightning scars. A schoolteacher swore that every page of her Bible had turned to the book of Revelation overnight. A stray dog, half-starved, appeared before the hall gates every dusk. and howled until morning, when it vanished again into the fog. By mid-month, Sheriff Flynn had taken to patrolling near the Ravencroft property each evening, shotgun across his knees. He told no one he carried a flask as well, though the bruise on his jaw from striking the bottle's neck against his teeth told the story. Once skeptical, Flynn had begun to notice things he couldn't align with reason. On some nights, distant singing rose through the birch trees, a low, rhythmic drone like chanting sailors. On others, faint lights moved behind the hall's windows, tracing pale shapes across the cliff face. Clara Winscombe continued her reporting unabated, though her entries had grown more strained in tone. Her dispatches now arrived to her editor smeared with salt stains and ink blots. One telegram read simply, "The hall breathes. No sound of wind but curtains shift. Something beneath the floors." In the Harbor Inn dining room one rainy evening, she confided to Dr. Greer, the coroner, who had grown to half pity the determined young reporter. "I hear tapping," Clara muttered, stirring her cold stew. "At first I thought it rats, but the tapping comes in threes. Sometimes it echoes my heartbeat." Dr. Greer studied her with grey patience. "You've been overworked, Miss Winscombe. Old houses speak all sorts of languages when you want them to." "Then translate this for me," Clara whispered, leaning close so the men by the hearth wouldn't hear. "Yesterday, I found a footprint in the drawing room dust. Bare, too small for a man, and still wet." The coroner swallowed hard, sighed, and stirred sugar into her tea, though she never drank it. "You're suggesting a child." Tried to muster righteousness against the rising tide of fear. He led candlelit processions, whispered exorcising psalms along the cliffs, and sprinkled holy water by the hall's locked gate. Yet dread clung like mildew. Parishioners began locking their doors 3 times. Some moved inland, claiming the sea had turned ill-tempered. One Sunday after Mass, a group of fishermen cornered the priest outside the chapel door, led by Eli Rourke, the same man who had hauled the Ravencroft relics from the tide weeks earlier. "She's cursed us all, Father," Eli said, eyes fevered. Behind him stood 3 others, reeking of rum and fear. "That Boston woman, she keeps stirring the grave dust. Since she came, aught not's been right. My own nets were shredded like paper yestermorn, like something clawed its way out of 'em." "God's trials take many forms," O'Leary replied, his hands trembling slightly on the prayer book. Rourke spat on the ground. "Then God best send a bigger net." He and his men turned away, leaving muddy footprints on the church floor. That night, O'Leary found the church doors ajar and every candle on the altar extinguished despite their new wicks. In the silence, he thought he heard soft breathing, childish, half-sobbed, somewhere near the sacristy. He fled before investigating. The next morning he told no one, not even Clara. The sheriff, exhausted, arranged a formal inspection of the Ravencroft property by daylight, seeking proof that might dispel hysteria. He, Clark the deputy, and Miss Winscombe entered again with fresh torches, determined to trace the tapping she claimed echoed her pulse. They swept each floor. The mirrors were spotted, the wallpaper curling, the air metallic as if lined with old coins. In a nursery they found a cradle long overturned, its canopy eaten by moths. Beside it lay a rag doll missing an arm, and underneath, a rough carving gouged into the floorboards. Letters so crooked they might have been cut by a trembling hand. "Help her." Flynn wiped sweat from his neck, though the house was cold. "You think somebody planted this?" he demanded. Clark swallowed. "Sir, whole floor creaks. Could have been there 30 years. "Then answer me this," Clara said softly, touching the fresh edge of one letter. Why is the wood still pale under the splinters, like it was cut yesterday? Before Flynn could reply, the air shifted. Something creaked above them. 2 slow, deliberate steps. The sheriff spun toward the ceiling with his revolver. "Anyone there? Speak." Dust fell, then silence. When they climbed to the attic, they found only an open window rattling in the cold wind. But on the sill sat another strange token, a small glass vial stoppered with wax. Inside, thick dark fluid clung to the sides. "Blood sample, likely human," Dr. Greer confirmed when she examined it later. "Old, but preserved. I cannot explain how it's remained liquid." That vial, too, Stark County evidence books would later label Item 9B, Unknown Origin. In the weeks that followed, the town balanced on the edge between disbelief and panic. Fishermen refused to sail past the cliffs. Even the tavern keeper locked his door at 10 and hung a crucifix above the ale casks. Clara's articles began appearing under sanitized headlines. "Eccentric doctor's legacy disturbs Main town." But privately, she filled her journals with darker sentences. "I dream of water in my lungs. When I wake, I smell salt on the sheets." The first tangible violence occurred on the 28th of November. A stable boy from the inn, sent to deliver supplies to Sheriff Flynn, was found unconscious by the roadside, his face bloodless, skin cold as stone. He survived, but never spoke again except to stammer a single phrase, "The man with no eyes." Flynn's men patrolled the cliff road in shifts after that, yet each sunrise they found their boot prints erased, as though the sea had crept up and licked the evidence away. The coroner urged the sheriff to seal the hall once more. "It's a place of contagion," she insisted, voice tight. "The sickness wasn't just in their heads. It lingers in the very dust. Decay of the mind spread by suggestion." Flynn stared into the fog from his office window. "And if suggestion starts killing folk, Doc, then what law do I enforce? The one written by God or by man? We may soon find they're one and the same." On the last day of November, snow threatened from the west. The bay air smelled of burning coal, and lamps threw yellow circles onto the damp cobbles. Clara sat in her small rented room, rereading notes by candlelight. Her fingertips trembled as she realized how her own handwriting had changed, sharper, more obsessive. She turned to the final page and heard that faint tap-tap-tap again, like someone beckoning from beneath the boards. This time, she didn't flee. She lowered herself to the floor and pressed her ear against the wood. The sound came steady, pulsing. Between each tap, a whisper rose, indistinct, almost mechanical, as if through a phonograph cylinder. "Come see, come see." Clara pinched out her candle and listened until dawn. The following morning she packed her satchel, left a note at the inn. "Gone to the hall once more. I'll not beg at its doorway this time," and set off up the hill alone. That was the last time anyone saw Clara Winscombe alive. The first blizzard of the season descended like an exhalation from the grave. Snow swallowed the coastline, the fields, the crooked fences. Even the ocean seemed to retreat beneath the white weight of it. By nightfall on December 1st, Taro's Bay was locked in a silence so deep it pressed against the lungs. In that murk of sleet and absence, Clara Winscombe made her final ascent toward Ravencroft Hall. At dawn, only her footprints told of the journey, steady, determined, vanishing halfway up the hill where the wind had scoured them clean. 3 days passed before the search began. The storm had crippled the town. Telegraph lines snapped, and the church's bell tower froze solid. On the 4th morning, Sheriff Flynn gathered a crew of 5 men with lanterns and ropes and trudged up the icy road. Among them were Dr. Greer, stoic despite the frost on her lashes, and Reverend O'Leary, clutching a worn Bible in gloved hands. The hall loomed through blown snow like a phantom ship, its slate roof half buried. The gate stood ajar, the lock broken clean, as if forced not by crowbar, but by a blast from within. Inside, the air was strangely warm. Even their breath hung in lazy curls rather than sharp plumes. The hearth in the grand hall flared low with coals that could not have survived 30 frozen years on their own. Flynn stared at the embers. Either someone's been squatting, or the house decided to keep itself. They split, moving room to room. Snowlight filtered through cracked panes, revealing spatter patterns of damp along the walls, the faint aroma of iron, blood, or something kin to it. Then, in the laboratory wing, the place once whispered about by townsfolk as the doctor's private clinic, Dr. Greer called out, her voice caught between awe and sickness. "Sheriff, you'll want to see this." They found an oak table in the center of the chamber, its surface ringed by a tangle of instruments. Glass electrodes, copper wire, jars partially filled with cloudy fluid. Above it hung what at first appeared to be a man-shaped model, until the smell confirmed it was no mannequin. The thing was human, or had been, stitched together crudely, but preserved by unknown means. Snowflakes drifted through a broken skylight and melted against its untouched skin. Greer clutched her kerchief to her nose. "Dear God, some mummification or embalming beyond any I know. Look at the sutures. This was deliberate, meticulous." Flynn's flashlight flicked across the wall. Journals, dozens of them, their spines layered in dust. He opened one. The handwriting was delicate, but firm. Iteration 414th complete. Stimulation yields respe... The rest blotted away. Dr. Ravencroft's own notes, Flynn muttered. He was experimenting with electricity, right? Resurrection through galvanic currents. O'Leary stepped back, trembling. "You will not speak that word in this room." Greer ignored him, eyes wide. "Resurrection or reanimation, Father? Call it what you will. These instruments predate the experiments we credit to Europe by decades. If this notebook is genuine, the man was attempting to restore motion to..." She stopped. The figure on the table twitched. Only a spasm. Only once, but enough to halt every breath in the room. The sheriff aimed his revolver instinctively. "Loose wire," Flynn said, voice gruff. "Must have been a charge built up from static." But no lightning storm raged outside now, only snow. They never found Clara that day. Only her satchel, resting beside the doctor's desk, the fountain pen snapped in two, and a page from her journal scrawled in haste. He spoke, not from the mouth, from the blood. It remembers. Those words would make their way into legend, but for the few who saw them that night, they felt less like journalism and more like confession. Back in town, the news broke quick as infection. Women crossed themselves. Men swore to burn the hall to the ground. Father O'Leary forbade it, warning that the devil feeds on rashness. Yet whispers swelled that Clara had uncovered the physician's final secret, something chained inside his laboratory for 30 years, a heart that had never ceased beating. At midnight on December 5th, Sheriff Flynn sat alone in his office, nursing another poor whiskey, when a faint knock rattled his door. It was Eli Rourke, drawn, hollow-eyed, reeking of salt. "She's back," Eli rasped. Flynn rose. "Who's back?" "Miss Winscombe. I saw her down at the wharf, walking where no footsteps stay." The sheriff stared, measuring the look in the fisherman's eyes, a glaze between terror and reverence. "You been drinking?" "When ain't I? But I saw her, Sheriff. Her coat wet through, hair hanging in her eyes. She looked at me, but the eyes, Lord save me, they were glass." Flynn holstered his gun, grabbed his coat. "You're taking me there." They trudged to the docks, the moon smothered by cloud. The tide hugged low, the water black as ink. There were footprints, indeed, bare ones, leading down the pier and ending abruptly at the edge, as though their owner had stepped calmly into the sea. Something else waited there too. A raven, dead and stiff, impaled on a rusted hook. Beside it lay a slip of paper, sodden but legible. In tenebris, lumen mane. In darkness, the light remains. Flynn pocketed it, not yet knowing he held Dr. Ravencroft's family motto. Within a week, the town began to splinter. Some insisted the hall be demolished, that science had birthed an abomination. Others claimed the place was sacred ground, a battlefield between divine and infernal powers, best left untouched. The Reverend leaned toward martyrdom. "This is punishment," he declared from the pulpit that Sunday. "We mocked the Almighty with our curiosity. We reopened the tomb." Dr. Greer rose from her pew mid-sermon, her voice cutting through incense and panic. "Ignorance is not piety, Father. This is no curse, it's infection of reason. If fear rules this town, then madness already won." But the congregation only murmured prayers louder to drown her words. Outside, the storm deepened to white oblivion, and in that muffled world, the hall burned. Witnesses from the hillside claimed to see a glow on the horizon. The mansion consumed in silent orange flame. No lightning, no explosion of coal stores. Only steady, perfect fire, as if the building had decided it was time to erase itself. Flynn's men reached it too late. The wind was cruel, the snow glowing copper in the blaze. Inside the ruins, nothing moved but collapsing beams. Yet, among the ashes, the sheriff found two impossible things: the table from the laboratory, intact, and the figure that had lain upon it, gone. 3 days later, the snow melted enough to reveal footprints leading from the ruins to the cliffs, then stopping at the precipice. They were small, perhaps feminine, barefoot despite the frost. On a nearby rock, a single raven perched and watched as though keeping vigil. The coroner closed her report with a line she'd never usually allow herself. "There are no conclusions, only residues." As for the townspeople, they buried what remained of Dr. Ravencroft's journals in a locked chest beneath the churchyard, swore silence, and prayed that the tide would wash history clean. Yet fishermen still claimed some nights to see a lone figure at the cliff's edge, a woman's silhouette with hair like seaweed, watching the black waves. And they said the ocean sang to her in a man's voice, low, rhythmic, electric, like something reawakening, remembering. What do you think? Guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? The voice of our modern narrator might ask through your screen as the imagery fades. Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Because even now, the line between miracle and monstrosity remains as thin as frost on those northern windows, and the name Ravencroft still echoes like a pulse beneath the Atlantic's skin. The aftermath of the Ravencroft fire was like the eye of a storm, mute, watchful, waiting to move again. The blaze itself had devoured the cliff sides for 2 days and 2 nights, a strange fire that hissed without crackling, burned through stone as though the granite were wax. By the third dawn, the air was sour with scorched brine. Ash fell like gray snow over the ruined town. Teams from the state militia arrived first, skeptical men from Augusta in stiff coats, armed with notebooks and disbelief. Behind them came insurance assessors and newspapermen hungry for sensation. What they found baffled mathematics and faith alike. Of the mansion, only its western wall remained, carved black and glass slick where masonry had run molten. No animal carcass, no trace of wood beams survived, not even iron nails. Yet, miraculously, one small object lay on the ground unscathed, a silver locket engraved with those same Latin words, in tenebris, lumen mane. It was presented to the sheriff in a kerchief, still faintly warm. By mid-December 1903, the story had escaped Taro's Bay, and conquered the Eastern press. Main mansion of Mad Doctor in Flames, the Boston Evening Chronicle announced, mercilessly omitting that their own correspondent had vanished there. The Portland Daily Herald christened it the house where science defied God. Various tabloids printed Clara Winscomb's rediscovered journal entries, stitched and sensationalized to titillate readers over breakfast plates. Whole phrases were invented. Claims that the doctor had promised immortality to his bloodline, that he owned a machine to steal lightning from heaven. The public devoured every word. Fear and fascination go down easily with morning coffee. Meanwhile, Sheriff Everett Flynn endured endless interrogations. Had he seen the reanimated corpses? Had he discovered Clara's remains? Did he truly believe the family was accursed? His answers, recorded in the state police archives, remained steady, weary, and half-defensive. I saw a house burn itself. I saw prints where no person walked. That's what I'll swear to. Father O'Leary, for his part, withdrew entirely from public notice, taking solitary vows and retreating to a remote monastery on Mount Desert Island. Parishioners said his final sermon before departure lasted only 6 words. We looked for knowledge and found hell. Dr. Wilhelmina Greer returned to her post in Portland, though not unchanged. Her students later recalled she began each lecture thereafter with an odd preface. Before you study anatomy, remember, there are limits for a reason. She never remarried, and when she died in 1912, her private papers revealed meticulous sketches of electrical circuits annotated in the Ravencroft hand. The designs would later puzzle engineers, who admitted that some of the prototypes prefigured 1920s biomedical devices by almost 2 decades. The investigation dragged through winter, complicated by the absence of conventional evidence. The remains recovered from the site totaled 4 partial skeletons, 3 male, 1 female, all decades old, none identifiable. The coroner's report described the bones as marred by crystalline residue consistent with saline fusing, origin unknown. The locket, the ring, and a handful of Ravencroft journals became the focal points of endless speculation. They passed from one authority to another until finally being locked within the archives of the Maine Historical Society, where they lie to this day, embargoed from public display at the family's request. The official verdict on the fire remains unspecified origin. Yet the shadows lengthened. Within months, strange stories surfaced along the coast. Sailors reported dense patches of fog glowing faintly blue from within, boats' compasses spinning wild when they crossed it. Farmers inland swore that lightning struck their fields under clear skies, leaving blackened patterns like branching veins. One ship captain swore in testimony that he saw, during a calm midnight, a woman's figure walking across the water toward the horizon, hair streaming behind her like seagrass, the glint of a silver chain at her throat. The federal government, ever nervous about rumor infecting progress, dispatched a quiet inquiry through the Department of War Sciences, ostensibly to assess unauthorized electrical experimentation. The officials arrived discreetly, filed sparse notes, and left faster than they were expected to. In their wake, a single telegram reached Sheriff Flynn. Cease all local inquiry. Property deemed quarantined under federal jurisdiction. And so, in bureaucratic language, the legend was buried. Yet Taros Bay never recovered. The harbor's business dwindled further each year until the wharf rotted away entirely. Families moved south. The church collapsed under neglect, and by the 1920s, the mapmakers erased the town name from most atlases. Only reefs and rusted watchtowers remain. Locals who still trace their bloodlines to those coasts refuse to speak the name Ravencroft with anything louder than a whisper. When the modern historian climbs those cliffs today, the wind still hums low among the stones. The same pitch, it seems, described by Clara Winscombe before she vanished. Foundations of the old hall lie half-buried, and on certain nights, a faint electric shimmer plays across them just before storms. Scientists attribute it to charged minerals. The townsfolk who remain nod politely at that explanation and bolt their shutters anyway. Sometimes a photograph surfaces. The Ravencroft portrait that hung above the mansion's hearth, rescued by an unknown hand. Experts who've examined the image claim a peculiar alteration. The painted doctor's left hand, which in earlier reproductions rests upon a book, now appears lifted slightly above it, as though mid-motion. No one can confirm when the change occurred, or if time itself has begun to repaint him. Museum staff store the portrait in a temperature-controlled basement, face down. The curator, when interviewed once for a university catalog, said quietly, "It hums when a thunderstorm passes." As for the ring, its location is lost entirely. Some believe the sheriff buried it with the journals. Others whisper it was stolen by a descendant and passed down, unseen, disguised, waiting for the next curious owner drawn to its engraving, in tenebris. And that, perhaps, is the truest curse, not the lightning nor the dead, but the hunger to know. Every century grants new instruments, new doctors, new Claras with their pens poised against the dark, convinced they will prove the impossible false. None succeed. The ocean keeps its confidences. So, what do you believe? Was the Ravencroft fire a grotesque failure of science? Or was it retribution for trespassing against creation itself? Was Clara Winscombe consumed by human hands? Or did she step across the boundary she sought to expose? The cliffs give no answer, save the whisper that returns each dusk from the sea, a hum beneath the waves, measured and electric, steady as a pulse. And thus the story closes where it began, in fog, in firelight, and in the uneasy silence between faith and knowledge. So what's your theory? Was this truth unveiled, or buried to protect the powerful? Write it in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story.